All right, so just for your information, you are in the Project Archivist skill session. I hope that you are expecting to be in that room. If you are not, then you can exit right now and you won't hurt my feelings. My name is Megan Sapp-Nelson. I'm the advisor for the Engineering Improvement Initiative team, and I am also the informal advisor for the Project Archivists. So the Project Archivists have more in common with each other than sometimes the other members of their teams. So we have created an informal cohort of the Project Archivists, and they meet together 3 times during the semester, and I will meet with you each time, and also will meet with you outside of class if you need any assistance or want any feedback or would like advice on how to implement initiatives within your team. And so I am the informal advisor of the Project Archivists, and that's one of the roles that I play in EPICS. So today we're here to talk about what does a Project Archivist do? Why would you be a Project Archivist? Why do we have that role in the EPICS structure? And then what are some techniques or tools that you can implement in your teams that will help to create better documentation within the normal workflow of an EPICS team? Okay. So again, I'm Megan. If you have any questions at all during the process of this particular lecture, please raise your hands and I'll answer them as we go along. With that, I'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so these are the objectives that we're going to cover today. Why do we have this thing called the Project Archivist? We're going to cover that. And then what is it like to be the Project Archivist on an EPICS team? What are the responsibilities of the Project Archivist? What are some tools you have at your disposal? And then what are some of the best practices for a Project Archivist? Okay, so first of all, why the Project Archivist? So the NASA Mars Polar Lander crashed on landing due to catastrophic failure caused by incorrect calculus. The only way that they know that is because they were able to go back and look at the project documentation and trace that error back. That's the only reason that they know where that error came from. One of my favorite engineering ethics case studies is City Core Towers. So they were required to retrofit the entire interior of the towers. Now, City Core Towers, have any of you seen that? It's in New York City, and it's a really interesting building because it is cantilevered over an existing church. So the church is sitting on the corner of the lot, and it's a beautiful old stone church. The church didn't want to sell, and so they bought the rest of the land around the church, and then they designed the building so that the weight of the structure is in the center of the buildings, not on the corners, and they cantilevered the corner over the church, right? So it's hard to picture, but picture the corner of a building dangling in air over a beautiful old stone church. Okay, so they built this building, got it up in the air, and then a graduate student at Princeton, a woman graduate student, go women, as part of her master's thesis, went back and re-examined that design because what she was interested in was the quartering winds on that design, and she wanted to know how they were countering those quartering winds, because quartering winds, basically you have direct winds that come in straight at a side, and then you have quartering winds that come in at an angle. And quartering winds are particularly hard to counter in a cantilever design because it's going to cause a twisting motion. She wanted to know how they were countering that. And when she redid the calculations, she was concerned that there was nothing to counter that, And in fact, they went back to the designer, and the designer discovered that what she thought was an error was not an error, but that the company that put the building together, the steel company, had changed the design as they were putting it together and went from doing welding at all of the joints in the sides of the building and went to riveting. And that would, in fact, impact the ability to counter quartering winds. So it wasn't the original design that was a problem, but it was the manufacturer process after the fact. They identified that it was a problem. They worked overnights and weekends, nonstop, in advance of hurricane season, and finished the retrofit just a couple of days before a hurricane hit New York City. They discovered this because of documentation. So documentation is part of engineering design, but it is crucial. It is crucial for engineers to be able to double check each other's work, to peer review each other's designs. It's also crucial that other individuals in our society be able to ensure that an engineering design is safe for human consumption. It's part of the engineering ethics code. And the only way that we can do that is through documentation or through tragic experiments, right? And so EPICS, we're not quite at the grand scale, but humans interact with our projects. And how do we know that humans will successfully interact with our projects? And how do we know that the teams that are coming after us understand what we have done so far? The only way that we know that is through documentation. And so that is what the role of the project archivist is intended to do, is to ensure that there is a level of documentation sufficient for future teams first, and then later the end users second, to be able to fully participate in that design, whether in creating the design or in consuming the design and providing feedback. All right, so this role, the project archivist, was actually created in response to a couple of recurring issues that happen in EPICS. The first is personnel turnover and the impact on delivering on time. So many times with EPICS teams, the project partner gives a desired delivery date, but due to the ongoing personnel turnover that happens in EPICS teams, which is just the nature of EPICS, right? Every semester your schedule changes. You may not be able to return to your team, and so someone else steps into your place on the team. Well, that person doesn't have the knowledge that you had, and you aren't there during that first meeting to tell them what you did last semester. All that is left is that documentation. That is your legacy from last semester. And if it is not good quality documentation that they can understand and complete documentation, then that team gets a setback every semester. And depending on how poor the documentation is, it may be an incredible setback. We've had projects that have started a design over from scratch because they could not understand the documentation. And so we've had problems with long delayed projects or projects that never delivered at all because of this recurring problem of personnel turnover with incomplete documentation. And then the problems of maintenance over time. So let's say you actually do deliver your project, and then 5 years down the road, that project comes back for maintenance to your team, because that does happen, particularly with the museum projects. How many of you are on a museum or a zoo team? Like 2 of you. Okay, your projects come back for maintenance because they are interacted with heavily with the public. They go in through a lot of wear and tear. Actually, camp has a has projects that go through a lot of wear and tear too. And so they go through pretty significant maintenance pretty frequently. When those projects come back for maintenance, you are relying on the documentation of teams 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, in order to understand what the original design was, in order to maintain that project and bring it back to a safe and performance level where you can redeploy it to the field again. And so for both of those reasons, we have to have good quality documentation for EPICS. So, something has happened to my, something happened to my font. It's interpreting it as squiggles. Okay, well that's interesting. All right, so the top one should say resources and the bottom one should say tools. It's a good thing I know my slide, even if the computer can't interpret it. The first is, what is involved in project management? The EPICS as a whole has a design document template. And that design document template is on the EPICS website. However, not all teams use the same design document template. And we'll go into that a little bit later. We are going to discuss the design document template and sort of the basic components here in a little bit. And then we'll talk about the teams that have a variation on it. Because my team, Environmental Improvement Initiative, is one of those teams that actually has a variation on the design document template. And then the best practices, hints, and tips document is another resource that is at your disposal. This is a institutional knowledge document. Every semester, at the end of the semester, I ask the project archivists who have just completed their semester what they have discovered in the process of doing their semester, what tools they've been using, what techniques they've used with their team, and then I add it to this document. And so it's basically just institutional knowledge of suggestions for what you can do to be an effective project archivist. So we'll go through that a little bit later. Down at the bottom, the process that you'll be going through. As a project archivist, you are responsible for leading conversations, and this is actually one of the largest parts of your job as the project archivist. It is, when we're talking about documentation, how would you define documentation for engineering? You can just answer, yeah. Requirements? Okay, sure. Requirements?
Records of what's been done and changes made.
Okay. Records of what's been done and changes made. What else? Yeah.
Files and photos.
Files and photos, sure.
Making sure that whatever you do can be done again.
Okay, reproducibility. Whatever you've done needs to be able to be done again. Yeah. Design decisions and their justifications. That's a huge one. Yeah. Any others? Okay. So conversations is really important because all of those things, you have to include not only those things, but the meaning around them. So it's all about context. Because you can include the design decisions that you made and the justifications for them, but if the person that's reading the document next semester doesn't understand why you made that decision, they can go back and redesign it to leave that decision out, right? And we've had teams do that where they totally redesigned a project because they didn't like the programming language that you selected, right? No, seriously, I was an advisor of a team that didn't like the programming language and went back and totally redesigned the project and set it back 2 semesters because they didn't like the programming language, right? If you have a clear justification of why you select the programming language, then there's a reason why they should not go back and redesign the program in a different programming language, right? So it's all about context. Conversations is where you make meaning around those things. So why are the files included? What's the meaning behind that? What's the context? Why are those documents included? What's the file? What's the meaning behind it, right? So a lot of the conversations you're having are what should be included, why is it there, why is it supposed to be there, okay? Encouraging compliance. So when I say encouraging compliance, I mean, why should people write documentation? Engineers got into engineering because they really like science and math, and they don't really want to write, right? Is this a stereotype? Maybe. Is it true more often than not? Yes. I speak as an advisor who's been doing this for 14 years. You get a lot of pushback on the documentation. There's a reason we have project archivists. And so trying to find ways to encourage people to make sure that their documentation is complete is one of the roles of the project archivist. You're going to do this in conjunction with your team leader and in conjunction with your advisor. It is not your role to hold them accountable for doing this. It is just your role to make sure everyone's thinking about their documentation, right? Making sure that they're aware of the fact that documentation should not be completed the last week of the semester just before they leave for Christmas break, right? That's not the time to do documentation because all the decisions were made in weeks 4 and 5 and 6. So you want the documentation to be made at the same time the decisions were made, right? Accountability for the team as a whole. Now I said that you're not in charge of accountability for the individuals, but if the whole team is not getting their documentation done, that's when the project archivist can speak up, right? Be like, hey guys, you know that at the end of the semester, we're going to have to turn in transition documentation for this project, right? Like we have a project documentation that that document has to be filled out completely at the end of the semester for the design stage that we're in. That is where you get to speak up and be the accountability. And then reminders for the individual. If you hear someone, particularly in your team, if you're doing, I don't know, in our team we do PIGS. Do your teams do PIGS, progress issues, goals? Yeah, thumbs up. You know, if you hear somebody in their progress say, well, we decided to do X for this reason, you can be like, hey, did you write that down in your documentation? Right? All right, so these are some of the tools that we have for capturing decisions. Progress issues, goals. I just talked about PIGS, right? Almost all the teams do them. They're pretty standard across EPICS, and they are very, very helpful for you as a project archivist to figure out which teams are making progress and should be writing documentation. So that's going to be one area where you can go ahead and keep an eye on things, drop a few hints that maybe some documentation should be being generated in those teams. Decision matrices. How many of you have made a decision matrix before? A couple of hands, okay. So particularly in design reviews, decision matrices are highly valued by your external reviewers as sort of the ultimate type of it's a way to take somewhat qualitative data and turn it into quantitative data. It's a way of ranking decisions and presenting it in a way that justifies those decisions. And it allows you to document your decision making in a way that is understandable for future teams down the road. Even if you don't use your decision matrices in your design review, which I don't know why you wouldn't, it's still a good plan to use those in your documentation because future teams will be able to understand the contents of those decision matrices and understand how you came to that decision. So going back to the original example that I used of the team that changed coding languages, had they used a decision matrix to rank coding languages for that particular application, and then showed the weighting for how they selected this particular coding language, and then showed ultimately the coding language that rose to the top, that would have given the future team the evidence that they needed in order to understand why they chose the coding language they did, so maybe they would not have changed paths midstream a couple of semesters down the road. Google Forms. Google Forms has been used by project archivists on multiple teams in past semesters as a way of inputting documentation across the team to collect it in one place for the team as a whole. So the way it works is that you set up a Google form, and basically you have a field for date, a field for individual, a field for team, and then just basically like a short answer section, and then maybe a blank to upload a JPEG. And then basically you remind people it's like a diary for the team. Everybody can go in, they can dump their date in, their name in, their team, their sub-team or project name in, and then they can put in, this week we made the decision to do this, because of this, this, and then they upload a picture if they took a picture of something and hit enter, and it dumps it into a central database for the team. And at the end of the semester, they basically just export it, and their team document for the semester is basically created. They just have to clean it up a little bit in terms of formatting. So that has been used with success on a couple of teams. That's an option for you. Peer review of documentation. We will be practicing that in this, in the Project Archivist skill sessions, the other 2 times we meet this semester. We meet in October and November, I believe, are when they're scheduled for, or maybe September and November, just before mid-semester design review and just before final design review. And for those peer review of design skill sessions, you bring in your team design document and we switch them, and you provide feedback to each other, and I'm here to provide feedback as well. And then you have an improved design document when you walk out of here for your mid-semester or final design review. You can do the same thing in your team meetings, where you have people exchange their individual design documentation and provide feedback to each other. And we will, in the particularly mid-semester peer review of design documentation class, talk about what are characteristics of good design documentation, what's characteristics of poor design documentation, and how to provide that feedback. If you're in a software team, JavaDocs or other comment aggregating software is your friend. You can basically create your documentation along with your software, and then just aggregate your documentation side by side with your software. So if you have not considered implementing that in your team, I suggest it. And then there's also a software code rubric, which has been created for EPICS, and it looks at human-centered code. So if you are on a code team and you want to be able to judge the quality of code and human readability of code, I can get that software code rubric to you. Okay, so the design document template is located under Purdue, and then under role specific, Project Archivist, and then there's the Design Document Guidelines, Design Document Template. So it takes you a couple of clicks to get there. And this is what it looks like. And your team will have to fill this out at the end of the semester unless you are told differently by your advisor. Okay? And the way that this works is that it is pegged to the specific design phase that your team is in. So what part of the design life cycle is your team in, and you will fill that part of the document out. And in theory, your team filled out the earlier phases of the design life cycle as they pass through them. Okay, so you should already have a copy of this document that would have, so if you're in phase 3 conceptual design, you would have a copy of the document that has phase 1 and phase 2 already completed, and you are working on phase 3. Now, if for some reason you have incomplete documentation, which happens a lot of times on teams, you may end up with a situation where your team for some reason has to start on phase 3 and you don't have a completed 1 and 2. That can happen at some points in time. Generally though, you would be, if your team is starting from scratch, you would be in phase 1. If you're getting ready to deliver, you would be in phase 5. And if a project's coming back for maintenance, you're in phase 6. Okay. And then the way that this works is that throughout the semester, you will be filling in the questions in number 6. And this is, when I'm talking about the Google form, you're basically, the Google form is filling out number 6 for you throughout the semester. As people are dumping their documentation into the Google form, they're just cutting and pasting into number 6 at the end of the semester. Then you are also filling in the semester documentation, your current semester. And so that would be the list of team members, the current status and location. So the location is basically where it is on the timeline, the goals for the semester, the budget, and then this transition report is really important and people overlook it. The transition report is actually, hey, next semester's team, this is where we got to, this is where you need to start, this is all the important information that you need to know in order to start there. All right, so that's 5.6.1. And 5.6.2 is, here's what we think you can get done next semester. So it's giving next semester a leg up. And then for your information, this past semester archive, when you get this document out of wherever on your SharePoint server from last semester, you would cut and paste number 6 and number 5, and you would move it into the past semester archive. Does that make sense? So then all that information is kept and just keeps growing each semester, and then you fill in your new semester's information. All right? Okay. So that's the standard document. And I would say like 2/3 of the teams use the standard document. And then there are some outliers. And I can tell you about one team's outliers because I am an advisor on that team. I came onto that team late and they were already doing it this way. So their document is formatted like a lab report. And so it looks different than this. Instead, it has a methods section, it has a resources section, it has it has a stakeholders section, And so it is not arranged by the life cycle, and instead it is